The Express REST API server that we implemented in the previous module allows any user to perform any of the get, put, post, or delete operations. There is no control on who can perform these operations. So, which means that if you run a server like that, then anybody can come into your server and start manipulating the information that is present within your database. This is obviously a dangerous situation. The way the server should be implemented is that you need to have some kind of restriction on which kinds of users will be allowed to perform which kinds of operations. So maybe you would allow an unauthorized user only to perform get operations. So for example, if you want a guest to be able to see information about the dishes in your restaurant or the menu of your restaurant and so on, that is perfectly acceptable. But you may allow only an administrator to go in and modify the information about a dish, or to delete a dish from the menu and also update an existing dish in the menu, or a promotion, or the information about the leaders in your server side. Now, you could also have another group of users, which would be registered users, who may be allowed to save some of the dishes as their favorite dishes, and only they would be able to manipulate the list of their favorite dishes. So that is another level of authorization or authentication that you need to perform. So you have different grades of users, and also depending on what kind of operations they would be allowed to perform. So all this means is that you need some kind of security to be built into your server side. We'll look at how we can authenticate users and then decide what kind of a user this client is. And then depending on the type of the user, you can allow the user to perform certain kinds of operations. We will start with the basic understanding of this, what we call as basic authentication in a server side for a client, and then build upon that throughout the rest of this module. And then at the end of this module, we will end up with a mechanism whereby we would be allowing users to register themselves, and registered users can perform certain operations that an unregistered user cannot, and so on. So we'll impose various kinds of access controls for various operations on the server side based upon the kind of user. So that sets you the perspective, or rather the idea of what you will encounter in this module. Let's start with basic authentication, the very basic mechanism that will enable us to authenticate users. Basic authentication in HTTP is a very simple mechanism which will ask the user for a username and password to be submitted with a request. And there is a specific structure on how this information will be sent from the client to the server side. So this is a method. The basic access authentication HTTP, which HTTP supports, is a method that will enable a server to challenge a client and ask for a username and password to be submitted by the client. So the server can challenge the client to authenticate itself by typing in this information. The client needs to send the username and password in response to the challenge from the server side. So every request message originating from a client should include the encoded form of the username and password in the request header that goes from the client to the server side. So when the server receives the request, the server will extract this information from the client's request header and then use that for authenticating the client before allowing access to the various operations on the server side. So how does this authentication work? If a client sends a request to the server and this client request does not include the authorization information, then the server will challenge the client, asking for the client to submit this information. The server challenges the client by including a header into the reply message coming in, the header with the type as www-authenticate, and then the second part where it specifies the type is where it will specify what kind of authentication the client needs to submit. And we will start with the understanding of basic authentication here. And also notice that the reply message will contain a 401 error code, which is unauthorized, which stands for unauthorized. So when the reply comes back from the server side, then the client, in response to this reply coming in, the client will have to send the request, including a specific header field in the request message of the type authorization. And this authorization header field will contain some information in there. For a basic authentication, this information would be in the form of, as the first word here will be basic, and then followed by a space here, and followed by a base 64 encoded string here. This base 64 encoded string encodes the username and password in a particular format and then includes that in the header. Now you're saying, if you send out a request message like this, including this in the header, then anybody in the middle. So if you know anything about security and how man-in-the-middle attacks can be launched, then obviously this can be retrieved by an intruder in between, and then can be used to fake the real client. Again, we are not getting into that question at the moment. When I talk about HTTPS in the next module, I will come back to address that issue in a bit more detail. But for the moment, the information in the header will be sent over without being encrypted in the header at this moment. Now, one other reason why I'm doing this is that so that we can actually look at the header directly and then see this information in the header itself. So when the client sends this request, then the server will extract the information from this authorization header in the request header and then use this information in order to verify whether this is an authorized client request or not. Now, of course, your next question would be, what exactly does this authorization header contain? The authorization header itself is constructed as follows. If you have a username and a password, these are the two pieces of information that you will use to authenticate a client. So the username and password will be concatenated into a single string by saying username and a colon and the password itself. So the username string, colon, and password will be concatenated together into an entire string here. This resulting string that we get here is then encoded using base 64 encoding. If you know about how encoding is done, base 64 encoding converts that into an ASCII header, like as shown in this example here. So this is nothing but a string of ASCII headers. Now, if you don't know much about base 64 encoding, don't worry about it. It doesn't impact your understanding of what is going on here anyway. So this base 64 encoded string, so this particular information is encoded into a string like this and then enclosed in the request header going from the client to the server. The request header itself is of the type authorization and then followed by the actual value here, which says basic and a space here and the base 64 encoded string here. So when this is received by our client, by our server, the server will extract this information, and then from here it will extract the username and password and then verify whether that matches an authorized user or not on the server side. To help you better understand how we actually organize the Express application and how the authentication itself is carried out, as we have learned earlier, Express applications themselves are organized in a set of middleware. And the way the Express application works is that the middleware are applied to the request and the response message in the order in which it is declared in my Express application. So if you have a Express dot use, and then you have the first one saying a static server, then after that you have another middleware, then after that you have another middleware. The sequence in which they are declared in the Express server's app.js file, for example, is the exact sequence in which the middleware will be applied. So an incoming request on the server side, as you recall in your Express application, the incoming request is treated as a request object. The response object is what the Express server constructs, and then the next is allows you to go on to the next middleware that you're going to be applying, and so on. So an incoming request like this, when it comes in, the first middleware is applied, and then once that middleware has transformed both the request and the response, it moves on to the next middleware, which is then applied to it. So for example, we saw that we applied Morgan first, then we applied body parser to the middleware. So they must have already transformed the request and the response objects. And then after that, we can include an authentication middleware in place there. The authentication middleware is going to authenticate the request. Now, so if you are using basic authentication, your request must contain in the header the authorization header in place there. So the authorization header will be extracted by the authentication middleware there and then checked to see if the user is authorized. And if the authentication middleware detects that you are an authorized user, then you will be allowed to proceed forward to the next set of middleware that follows the authentication step there. And your request will be processed by the subsequent middleware. But on the other hand, if your authentication middleware decides that you are not an authorized user, then the authentication middleware will take you along a different path and then generate an error and then send back an appropriate error reply to the client side and will be redirected to the error handler. So this redirection to the error handler will be done by calling next with the error as the parameter to the next here. So the next is exactly this next that we see in the request resource next here. And so that will take you all the way down to the error handler, which will handle the error and then send back the error message back to the client side, indicating the failure of the authentication. So this is how your typical basic authorization or basic authentication works in your server-side application. Having understood this, let's move on to the exercise where we will implement the basic authentication in our application and see how it authenticates users.